The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the small restaurant on Galactic Station, Meridian 7. The place was called Earth's Hearth, and it sat in a quiet corner of the station's busy market district. It was not a fancy restaurant. The tables were simple wood, the chairs were old but comfortable, and the walls were decorated with pictures of Earth landscapes that most aliens had never seen. But every evening, the place was full. Aliens of all kinds came here to eat. Tall insectoid Crithians sat next to small furry Melvari. Blue-skinned Orinthi shared tables with the reptilian Torvani. They came from different worlds, spoke different languages, and had different customs. But they all agreed on one thing. The old human who ran this kitchen made the best food on the station. His name was Frank Morrison. He was 67 years old, with gray hair that he kept short and hands that showed the signs of a lifetime of hard work. He moved through his kitchen with slow, careful steps, checking pots and stirring sauces. He never rushed. He never raised his voice. He simply cooked, hour after hour, with a quiet focus that his young assistant found both impressive and strange. That assistant was Lucy Grant, a 24-year-old woman with bright red hair and a smile that never seemed to fade. She had worked for Frank for 2 years now, and in all that time, she had learned almost nothing about him. She knew he was a good boss. She knew he was patient with her mistakes. She knew he could make any ingredient taste like magic. But his past? His life before this restaurant? That was a closed door that Frank never opened. Lucy glanced at him as she carried plates to a waiting table. Frank stood at the stove, his back to her, stirring something that smelled wonderful. And as always, she noticed the scar. It ran from his left temple all the way down to his jaw. It was old and faded, but it was impossible to miss. In 2 years, Lucy had never found the courage to ask about it. Something in Frank's eyes whenever anyone looked too long at his face told her the story behind that scar was not a happy one. The evening rush was in full swing. Lucy moved between tables, taking orders, delivering food, and cleaning up empty plates. She smiled at the regular customers and greeted the new ones. Earth's Hearth was more than just a restaurant to her. It felt like a second home. At a corner table near the window sat Vekris, a young Torvani scholar. His green scales caught the light as he watched the kitchen door with curious eyes. Vekris came here almost every evening. He was writing a research paper about human culture, and he believed that the best way to understand a species was to study their food. But lately, his attention had moved from the food to the cook. Frank Morrison fascinated him. The old human moved like someone who carried a heavy weight on his shoulders. His eyes were kind but sad, and that scar on his face told a story that Vekris desperately wanted to hear. Tonight, Vekris decided he would finally ask. The door opened, and a group of Crithian traders walked in. They were tall, with shiny black shells and multiple arms that clicked together as they moved. They looked around the restaurant with obvious distaste. "Human food," one of them said loudly. "I still do not understand why anyone would eat such primitive things." His companions made sounds of agreement. They sat down at a table near the center of the room, still talking about how simple and boring human cuisine was compared to the complex chemical meals of their homeworld. Lucy's smile faded. She looked toward the kitchen, worried about how Frank would react, but Frank simply walked out with a tray of food for another table. He passed the Crithians without looking at them. His face showed nothing. Not anger, not hurt, just calm emptiness. He served the food to a grateful Orinthi family, accepted their thanks with a small nod, and returned to his kitchen. Lucy followed him inside. "Don't you want to say something to them?" she asked quietly. "They were so rude." Frank shrugged. "Words don't change minds. Food does." He picked up a knife and began cutting vegetables with practiced ease. "If they're hungry enough to come in, they'll eat. If they eat, they might change their opinion. If they don't change their opinion, that's fine too. I'm not cooking to prove anything." Lucy wanted to argue, but she knew Frank well enough to know when a conversation was over. She grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and went back to work. The evening continued. The Crithians ordered food with obvious reluctance. When it arrived, they ate in suspicious silence. By the end of their meal, they were ordering seconds. They paid and left without saying anything kind. But Lucy noticed they left a very generous tip. Small victories. She thought with a smile. As the crowd thinned out, Frank began preparing the last few orders of the night. Vekris was still at his corner table, his food long finished, his eyes still fixed on the kitchen door. Finally, he stood up. His heart was beating fast as he approached the counter where Frank was wiping down the surface. The old human looked up at him with polite curiosity. "Did you enjoy your meal?" Frank asked. "Yes, very much. Thank you." Vekris paused, his tail twitching nervously. "I wanted to ask you something, if that is acceptable." Frank nodded. "Go ahead." Vekris took a breath. His people valued honesty, and they believed that asking questions was a sign of respect. But he also knew that some questions could cause pain. He looked at Frank's face, at the scar that he had wondered about for months. "The mark on your face," he said softly. "How did you get it?" The kitchen went silent. Lucy stopped moving. She stood frozen with a stack of plates in her hands, staring at Frank with wide eyes. In 2 years, no one had ever asked him that question directly. She had no idea how he would respond. Frank's expression did not change. He looked at Vekris for a long moment, and something shifted in his old gray eyes. It was not anger. It was something deeper. Something that looked almost like relief. 40 years, he said quietly. "It's been 40 years since anyone asked me that." He put down his cleaning cloth and looked toward a small table near the window. Without another word, he walked over and sat down, gesturing for Vekris to join him. Lucy set down her plates and moved closer, unable to hide her curiosity. Whatever story Frank was about to tell, she was going to hear it. Frank folded his hands on the table and looked out the window at the stars. When he spoke, his voice was calm but heavy with memories. "I wasn't always a chef," he began. Before everything, I was a combat medic with the United Earth Defense Corps." Lucy felt her breath catch in her throat. "A soldier." Frank had been a soldier. The old man continued, his eyes distant now, looking at something far beyond the walls of his little restaurant. "I was stationed on a small colony world called Haven's Rest. It was a peaceful place. Farms and families. Humans and aliens living side by side." He paused. "I thought I would spend my whole service there, treating broken bones and minor sicknesses. I was wrong." The door opened behind them, and someone walked in. Frank looked up, and his face went pale. Standing in the doorway was an elderly Selvari woman. She had silver fur and golden eyes, and she wore the faded uniform of a retired military commander. She stared at Frank as if she had seen a ghost. "By the stars," she whispered. "You're the human from Haven's Rest." Frank nodded slowly. "Hello, Commander Nihilith." The Selvari walked forward, her eyes never leaving Frank's face. She sat down at the table without asking permission. "Tell them," she said, her voice shaking. "Tell them what you did. Tell them what your kind is capable of." Lucy and Vekris exchanged confused looks. But Frank just took a deep breath and continued his story. The night was about to get much longer. Commander Nihilith sat across from Frank, her golden eyes filled with an emotion that Lucy could not quite understand. It was something between respect and sorrow. The old Selvari looked like someone who had carried a secret for a very long time and was finally allowed to speak it. Vekris leaned forward, his scales catching the soft light of the restaurant. His curiosity had turned into something deeper now. He could feel that he was about to hear something important. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, looking at Frank. "I did not mean to bring up painful memories." "If you would rather not talk about it." "No," Frank said gently. He gave Vekris a small, tired smile. "You asked an honest question. You deserve an honest answer." He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and small burns from years of cooking. "Besides, it's been too long since I told this story. Maybe it's time." Lucy quietly pulled a chair over and sat down. She did not want to interrupt. She just wanted to listen. Frank took a deep breath and began. "Haven's Rest was beautiful," he said. "Green hills, clean rivers, blue skies. It was the kind of place people dreamed about when they thought of a fresh start. The colony had about 5,000 people. Most of them were farmers. Humans, Tervani, Melvery, a few other species. We all lived together peacefully." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "I was 27 years old, young and stupid and full of hope. The Defense Corps had sent me there because it was supposed to be a quiet posting. No danger, no conflict. Just a small medical station where I treated cuts and colds and the occasional broken bone." Vekris tilted his head. "You said you were a combat medic. That sounds like you were trained for war." "I was," Frank admitted. "But I had never seen real combat. Not then. I thought I was prepared for anything." He shook his head slowly. "I was not." Commander Nihilith made a soft sound. "No one is ever prepared for what you faced." Frank acknowledged her words with a small nod, but continued his story. "I became friends with the locals. There was a Torvani family that lived near the medical station. A farmer named Keleth, his wife Soraya, and their daughter Mira. She was 8 years old. Bright green scales, huge curious eyes, and a laugh that could make anyone smile." Vekris went still. He was Tervani too. Hearing about a family of his own kind made the story feel closer somehow. "Myra loved to watch me cook," Frank said with a faint smile. "Her people ate mostly raw food, so the idea of using fire and spices was fascinating to her. She would sit on a stool in my kitchen and ask 100 questions. Why do you add salt? Why does bread rise? Why do humans eat so many different things?" Lucy smiled despite herself. She could picture it clearly. "I taught her to make bread," Frank continued. "Simple flatbread, nothing fancy. But she was so proud of herself when it came out right. She said she was going to open a restaurant someday. Just like me." His smile faded. "She was a good kid. They were a good family." The restaurant was completely silent now. Even the hum of the station outside seemed far away. "We had been on Haven's Rest for almost 2 years when the Varax came," Frank said. His voice hardened. "Do you know the Varax?" Vekris nodded slowly. Everyone in the galaxy knew the Varax. They were raiders, slavers, killers. They attacked isolated colonies and took whatever they wanted. Goods, supplies, people. They were cruel without reason and violent without mercy. "They came without warning," Frank said. One morning, the sky was blue and peaceful. By noon, it was filled with Varax ships. They hit the defense towers first, knocked out our communications, and surrounded the main settlement before anyone could escape. His hands tightened on the table. We had a small defense force. 50 soldiers led by Captain Diane Russo. She was tough, smart, and she cared about every single person in that colony. When the attack started, she organized an evacuation. Women, children, elderly, anyone who couldn't fight. She got them to a shelter on the edge of the settlement. An old storage building with thick walls and only one entrance. "What happened to her?" Lucy asked softly. Frank's jaw tightened. "She died." took a plasma bolt to the chest while holding the line so the last civilians could reach the shelter. She bought them 10 extra minutes with her life. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. After she fell, I was the highest-ranking person left alive. The other soldiers were dead or scattered. The Varaks were closing in, and I was standing in front of a building filled with 200 terrified people. Vekris's eyes widened. "You were alone?" "Mostly," Frank said. "A few farmers tried to help, but they had no weapons, no training. I sent them inside. Told them to barricade the door from the inside and not open it for anyone until the rescue fleet arrived." "A rescue fleet?" Lucy repeated. "Someone called for help?" Commander Nyleth spoke up. "The colony's emergency beacon was activated before the communication towers fell. It sent a distress signal to the nearest military outpost. But outpost was 6 hours away at maximum speed." 6 hours. Lucy felt sick. 6 hours was an eternity when an army of killers was at your door. "Kelleth wanted to stay with me," Frank continued. "He grabbed a farming tool and said he would fight beside me. But Mira was in that shelter, hiding with her mother. I told him his daughter needed him more than I did." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, warm book. The cover was old leather, cracked and faded from years of use. "I gave him my grandmother's recipe book," Frank said quietly. "I told him that if I didn't come back, someone should keep cooking." He cried when he took it, big Tovani tears rolling down his green face. Then he went inside, and I closed the door behind him. He put the book back in his pocket, and then I turned around to face the Varaks. Vekris could barely breathe. How many were there? Their main force had moved on to loot the settlement. But the commander sent a raiding party to capture the civilians. About 50 soldiers. Heavily armed, well-trained, and very confident. 50 against 1. Lucy whispered. Frank nodded. The Varak's commander walked up to me like I was a joke. He was big, almost 8 feet tall, covered in black armor and carrying a blade as long as my arm. He looked at me standing there with my sidearm and my medical kit, and he laughed. The old chef's eyes grew cold at the memory. He asked me what one human thought he could do against his army. Commander Nyleth leaned forward, her voice tight. "What did you say?" Frank met her eyes. For a moment, he was not an old chef in a small restaurant. He was a young man standing alone against impossible odds, with nothing but his training and his will to protect the innocent people behind him. I said, "Enough." The word hung in the air like the echo of a gunshot. Lucy felt tears forming in her eyes. She did not know what happened next, but she knew it would break her heart. Frank looked back at Vekris, at this young Tovani scholar who had only wanted to learn about humans and their strange cooking habits. "Are you sure you want to hear the rest?" he asked gently. "It does not have a happy middle, only a hard one." Vekris nodded firmly. His people valued stories, especially stories of courage. And he could already tell that this was the most important story he would ever hear. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me what one human can do." Frank closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, they were filled with 40 years of memories. "Then let me tell you about the longest night of my life." The sun had set over Haven's Rest, and the fires from the burning settlement lit the sky in shades of orange and red. Frank stood alone in front of the shelter door, watching 50 Vorak soldiers spread out before him like a dark wave. His heart was pounding. His hands were steady. He was terrified. But fear was something he could use. The Varak's commander stood at the front of his soldiers, still laughing at the small human who dared to stand in his way. His black eyes showed nothing but amusement. "Move aside, little creature," he said. His voice was deep and harsh, like stones grinding together. "Give us the slaves inside, and we will let you live. Resist, and you will die screaming." Frank did not move. He looked at the commander, then at the soldiers behind him, then at the burning buildings in the distance. 200 people depended on him. Mothers, children, elderly, friends. He thought of Myra, hiding in the darkness with her father. He thought of the bread she had learned to make. He thought of all the futures that would end if he stepped aside. "No," he said simply. The commander stopped laughing. His amusement turned to irritation. "You are one human. You have no chance." "Maybe not," Frank agreed. "But I'm not trying to win. I'm just trying to give them time." The commander hissed and raised his blade. "Then time is all you will have." A few painful minutes before death. Frank smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had already accepted what was coming. Let's find out. The first Varak soldier charged. He was fast, much faster than any human. His clawed hands reached for Frank's throat. Frank stepped to the side, drew his sidearm, and fired 3 shots into the soldier's chest. The Varaks fell and did not get up. The other soldiers paused. They had not expected that. Frank did not wait for them to recover. He moved. He had been trained as a combat medic, which meant he knew every weak point on every species in the United Earth Alliance and its enemies. He knew where their organs were. He knew where their blood flowed. He knew exactly how to hurt them in ways that would slow them down or stop them forever. The second soldier came from his left. Frank dodged under his swing and jammed a medical injector into the soft tissue under his arm. The drug was meant to stop bleeding during surgery. In a healthy body, it caused the blood to thicken and clot in seconds. The soldier collapsed, his heart unable to pump the sludge that his blood had become. The third and fourth came together. Frank shot one in the knee, dropping him to the ground, then used his body as a shield against the other's blade. While the fourth soldier hesitated, Frank grabbed a fallen weapon and drove it through his throat. 5 soldiers down in 30 seconds. The remaining Varaks finally realized they were not fighting a helpless victim. They were fighting something far more dangerous, a desperate human protecting children. The commander screamed orders. The soldiers stopped their careless charges and began to coordinate. They spread out, trying to surround Frank, trying to overwhelm him with numbers. But Frank had been busy too. While they regrouped, he had moved to a pile of supply crates near the shelter. He kicked one open and found what he was looking for. Chemical fertilizer from the farms. Highly flammable. He grabbed a handful, shoved it into an empty medical container, and added a spark from his igniter. The explosion was not big, but it was bright and loud. 3 Varak soldiers caught fire. Their screams filled the night as they rolled on the ground, trying to put out the flames. Frank used the distraction to take down 2 more. 8 soldiers gone. 42 left. Inside the shelter, the colonists could hear everything. The gunshots, the explosions, the screams. Kelleth held his daughter close, his arms wrapped around her trembling body. Mira buried her face in his chest, trying to block out the terrible sounds. "Father," she whispered, "is Frank going to be okay?" Kelleth did not know how to answer. He could hear the battle raging outside, could hear the rage of the Varaks and the cold, methodical responses of a single human fighter. He wanted to believe Frank would survive, but he knew the truth. Frank was not fighting to survive. He was fighting to delay. "He's doing what humans do," Kelleth said softly. "He's protecting us." Myra looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Why? We're not his family. We're not even his species." Kelleth stroked her head gently. "That it doesn't matter to humans. They protect everyone, even people they just met, even people who are different from them." He paused. "That's what makes them special." Outside, the battle continued. Frank had lost track of time. His body was covered in cuts and bruises. His left arm was bleeding from a deep gash. His ribs ached from a blow he had not dodged fast enough, but he was still standing. 15 Varak soldiers lay dead around him. Others were wounded, crawling away or lying still. The ground was stained with blood. Both theirs and his. The commander watched with growing fury. He had expected to crush this human in seconds. Instead, his force was being torn apart by one man with nothing but basic weapons and impossible determination. "What are you?" the commander demanded. "What kind of creature fights like this?" Frank wiped blood from his eyes. "A human," he said. "Just a regular human." The commander charged. He was faster and stronger than any of his soldiers. His blade moved like lightning, slashing at Frank from every angle. Frank dodged the first strike, blocked the second with a piece of metal debris, and took the third across his face. The pain was blinding. He felt the blade cut deep, from his temple to his jaw. Blood poured down his face, filling his left eye with red. But he did not fall. He grabbed the commander's arm, pulled him close, and shoved his last medical injector into the alien's neck. The sedative was meant for surgery patients. In this dose, it would not kill the commander, but it would slow him down. The huge Virax staggered. His eyes went unfocused. His blade dropped from his weakened grip. Frank picked it up and drove it into the commander's heart. The Virax army froze. Their leader was dead. The impossible human was still standing, covered in blood and wounds, holding their commander's own blade. Frank looked at them with his one good eye. His voice was hoarse from exhaustion, but his words were clear. "Who's next?" No one moved. For a long moment, the surviving Virax just stared at him. This human who should have died in seconds. This weak, soft creature who had killed their strongest warriors with nothing but his bare hands and his refusal to give up. Then, in the distance, they heard the sound of engines. Frank looked up at the sky. Through the smoke and fire, he could see lights. Many lights. Moving fast. The rescue fleet had arrived. The Virax saw it too. They looked at each other, then at the blood-soaked human standing between them and the shelter. They ran. They fled to their ships, leaving their dead behind, abandoning their wounded. Within minutes, they were gone, racing for the stars before the human warships could catch them. Frank watched them go. Then his legs gave out. He collapsed. Onto the ground, the commander's blade slipping from his fingers. His body was broken. His face was ruined. His blood was soaking into the dirt of the colony he had sworn to protect. But he was smiling, because behind him, the shelter door was opening. And the first face he saw was little Myra, running toward him with tears streaming down her green cheeks. "Frank!" she screamed. "Frank!" He tried to speak, tried to tell her he was okay, but no words came out. He could only watch as she knelt beside him, her small hands pressing against his wounds, trying to stop the bleeding just like he had taught her. "Don't die," she begged. "Please don't die. You have to teach me more recipes." Frank managed a weak laugh. It hurt, but it was worth it. Behind Mira, soldiers from the rescue fleet were running toward them. Medical teams, combat squads, help that had finally arrived. One soldier knelt beside Frank, checking his wounds. "Stay with us," he said urgently. "You're going to be okay." Frank grabbed his arm with the last of his strength. His voice was barely a whisper. "The children, are they safe?" The soldier looked toward the shelter, where 200 colonists were emerging into the night, alive and unharmed because one man had refused to let them die. "Yes," he said softly. "They're all safe." Frank closed his eyes. And for the first time in hours, he let himself rest. The restaurant was silent. Lucy had tears running down her face. She did not bother to wipe them away. Vekris sat completely still, his green scales pale with emotion. Even the air seemed heavier, thick with the weight of Frank's story. Commander Nihilith was the first to speak. "I was on that rescue fleet," she said quietly. "I was a young officer then, barely 30 years old. When we landed, I was part of the first team to reach the shelter." She paused, her golden eyes lost in memory. I will never forget what I saw. The ground was covered with Varak's bodies. More than 30 of them. Their commander lay dead with his own blade in his chest. And in the middle of it all, there was one human. Just one. Broken and bleeding, barely alive, but still trying to protect the people behind him. Frank said nothing. He just looked at his hands. The medical team worked on you for hours, Nihilith continued. They said you should have died 10 times over. The blood loss alone should have killed you. But you kept fighting. You kept holding on. I had a reason to, Frank said softly. Lucy finally found her voice. What happened after? After they saved you? Frank leaned back in his chair. The memories were easier now that the hardest part was over. I spent 3 months in a military hospital. The doctors fixed what they could, but the scar, he touched his face. They said it was too deep. It would never fully heal. I told them it didn't matter. Scars are just stories written on the skin. Vekris shook his head slowly. You say it like it was nothing. But what you did, it was incredible. 1 human against 50 Varak soldiers. You should not have survived. I almost didn't, Frank admitted. But humans are stubborn. We don't know when to quit. Sometimes that's a weakness. Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps us alive. Commander Nihilith made a sound that might have been a laugh. The Varaks learned that lesson the hard way. After Haven's Rest, they never attacked another colony with humans in it. Word spread through their ranks about the one man who had destroyed an entire raiding party. They called you the Red Ghost. Lucy blinked. The Red Ghost? Because of the blood, Nihilith explained. When the survivors described you, they said you were covered in so much blood that you looked like a ghost risen from death itself. The Varaks are superstitious. They believed you were some kind of demon. Frank smiled faintly. I was just a medic who got angry. Nothing supernatural about it. That's what makes it more impressive, Vekris said. You were not a warrior. You were not trained for battle. You were a healer who chose to fight because there was no one else. Frank nodded slowly. That's the thing about humans. We're not the strongest species. We're not the fastest or smartest. But when we have something to protect, we become something else. Something that doesn't care about odds or logic. We just refuse to let go. He looked at Vekris directly. You're Torvani, like Keleth and his family. You understand loyalty, don't you? The bond between parent and child? Yes, Vekris said softly. Family is everything to my people. For those few hours, those colonists were my family, Frank said. Every single one of them. The children hiding in the dark. The parents holding them close. The elderly praying for help that might never come. I couldn't let them die. I couldn't let those kids grow up as slaves. So I fought. Lucy wiped her eyes. What happened to Myra? And her family? For the first time since he started talking, Frank's expression lightened. A real smile crossed his scarred face. They survived. All of them. The colony was rebuilt, and Keleth went back to farming. Myra grew up healthy and happy. She went to school, studied xenobiology, got married, had children of her own. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out the old recipe book. Keleth tried to give this back to me when I was released from the hospital. I told him to keep it. I said I didn't need it anymore. He chuckled softly. He refused, said it belonged to me, and that someday I would want it again. Vekris looked at the worn leather cover. He was right. He usually was, Frank agreed. Smart man. Good friend. He passed away about 15 years ago. Natural causes. His wife died a few years later. But Myra is still out there, somewhere. Still living her life. Commander Nihilith leaned forward. You said something earlier. You said you became a chef after you left the military. Why? After everything you did, you could have had any career you wanted. You were a hero." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he set the recipe book on the table and looked at it with gentle eyes. "When I was lying in that hospital bed, I had a lot of time to think. I thought about all the people I had killed, all the blood on my hands. I was proud of what I had done, but I was also tired. Tired of violence. Tired of death. Tired of being the red ghost." He touched the book's cover. "One day, Mira came to visit me. She was still a kid then, maybe 9 years old. She brought me a piece of bread. She had made it herself, following my grandmother's recipe." He smiled at the memory. "It was terrible. Too much salt, not enough yeast, burn on the bottom. But I ate every bite, and I told her it was the best thing I had ever tasted." Lucy laughed through her tears. "Was it really that bad?" "Worse," Frank said with a grin. "But that wasn't the point. The point was that this little girl, who had seen her home destroyed, who had hidden in the dark while monsters tried to break down the door, was still trying to create something. She wasn't thinking about death or revenge. She was thinking about bread." He picked up the book and held it carefully. "That's when I understood. Fighting keeps people alive. But cooking? Cooking gives them a reason to live. It brings people together. It creates joy instead of pain. And I decided that I had done enough fighting for one lifetime." Vekris nodded slowly. "So you became a chef?" "I became a chef," Frank confirmed. "I left the military, moved to this station, and opened this little restaurant. I called it Earth's Hearth because I wanted it to feel like home. A place where anyone could come, no matter their species or background, and share a good meal." Commander Nyleth looked around the restaurant with new eyes. The simple tables, the comfortable chairs, the pictures of Earth on the walls. It all made sense now. "This place is your shelter," she said softly. "You're still protecting people, just in a different way." Frank considered her words, then nodded. "I suppose you're right. Old habits die hard." Lucy stood up suddenly. She walked around the table and hugged Frank tightly. He stiffened for a moment, surprised, then relaxed and patted her back gently. "Thank you," she whispered, "for telling us." "Thank you for listening," he replied. Vekris stood as well. He straightened his posture and placed one hand over his heart in the traditional Torvani gesture of deep respect. "Among my people, there is an old saying. The greatest warrior is not the one who defeats the most enemies. It is the one who protects the most lives." He bowed deeply. "You are a great warrior, Frank Morrison. The greatest I have ever met." Frank's eyes glistened, but he did not let the tears fall. He simply nodded in acknowledgement. "I'm just an old man who makes soup," he said quietly. "But thank you." The door to the restaurant opened again. None of them had noticed, but a small crowd had gathered. Other customers who had come in during Frank's story, drawn by the quiet intensity of his words. Aliens of a dozen different species, standing in respectful silence. One of them was a Crithian, the same trader who had insulted human food earlier that evening. He stepped forward, his insectoid face unreadable. "I heard your story," he said. His voice was different now, softer. "I was wrong about humans. I was wrong about you." He bowed, a deep and formal gesture that Crithians reserve for their greatest elders. One by one, the others followed, bowing, nodding, showing respect in whatever way their cultures allowed. Frank looked at them all. These strangers who had become witnesses to his past. He did not know what to say, so he said the only thing that felt right. "The kitchen is still open. Would anyone like something to eat?" Word spread across Galactic Station Meridian 7 faster than light. By the next morning, everyone knew about the old human chef with the scar on his face. Traders talked about him in the market halls. Travelers mentioned him in spaceport waiting areas. Families discussed him over breakfast, and children asked their parents to tell them the story again. The Red Ghost, the man who held back an army, the cook who used to be a killer. Lucy arrived at Earth's hearth an hour before opening time, expecting to help Frank prepare for a normal day. Instead, she found a line of people waiting outside the restaurant. Dozens of them, maybe 100. They stretched down the corridor and around the corner. A rainbow of alien species standing patiently in the early morning light. She pushed through the crowd and found Frank inside, already working in the kitchen. He looked up when she entered, and his expression was a mixture of confusion and amusement. "I don't know what's happening," he said. "They started gathering before dawn." Lucy laughed despite herself. "You really don't understand, do you? You're famous now. The whole station knows your story." Frank frowned. "I didn't ask for that. I just told the truth." "That's exactly why they're here," Lucy said gently. "They don't want to see a celebrity. They want to see the man who chose to protect strangers. They want heat food made by hands that could have killed but chose to create instead." Frank was quiet for a long moment. He looked out at the crowd through the kitchen window, at all those faces waiting to meet him. "I don't know if I can feed all of them," he admitted. Lucy smiled and tied on her apron. "Then let's find out." They opened the doors. The day that followed was the busiest in Earth's hearth history. Lucy ran between tables so fast that her feet ached. Frank worked in the kitchen without rest, cooking dish after dish with the same quiet care he always showed. They ran out of bread by noon and had to make more. They ran out of soup by mid-afternoon and had to start a new batch, but no one complained. The customers waited patiently, talking among themselves, sharing their own stories of humans they had met. Some had worked with humans in the military. Others had human neighbors or friends. A few had never met a human before today and had only heard rumors about the strange species from the distant planet called Earth. By evening, the crowd had not thinned. If anything, it had grown. Commander Nihilus returned, this time in her formal military dress. She brought with her a group of retired officers from the Selvari fleet, all of whom wanted to shake Frank's hand. They told him that his story was being entered into the official Selvari military records as an example of extraordinary courage. Vickers came back too, carrying a stack of papers. He had written about Frank all night, he explained. His research on human culture had found its heart. He planned to publish the story in academic journals across the galaxy, ensuring that future generations would know what one human had done on Haven's Rest. Frank accepted their words with humble grace. He thanked them for their kindness and returned to his kitchen, where he felt most at home. As the second evening rush began, something unexpected happened. A young Tovani woman walked into the restaurant. She had bright green scales and large, gentle eyes. She looked to be in her 40s, which meant she was probably in her early middle age by Tovani standards. Behind her came two smaller Tovani, clearly her children, and an older male who moved with the slow dignity of someone who had seen many years. Frank froze when he saw them. The woman walked straight to the kitchen counter and stood there, looking at him with an expression that mixed joy and sorrow and overwhelming gratitude. "Hello, Frank," she said softly. Frank's voice caught in his throat. "Myra?" She smiled, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, sitting on a stool in his kitchen, asking why bread rises and what makes soup taste good. "I heard your story was finally told," she said. "I came as fast as I could." Frank walked out of the kitchen on unsteady legs. He stopped in front of her. This child he had once taught to make bread, now grown into a woman with children of her own. "You're here," he whispered. "You're really here." Mira reached out and touched the scar on his face. Her fingers were gentle, tracing the line from his temple to his jaw. "I've thought about this scar every day of my life," she said. "Every time I looked in the mirror, Every time I saw my children smile, I remembered that I was only alive because of you. Frank shook his head. I was just doing my job. No, Myra said firmly. You were doing something far greater than any job. You were choosing us over yourself. You were deciding that our lives mattered more than your own. She turned to the two young Torvani behind her. They were staring at Frank with wide, curious eyes. These are my children, Myra said. Keleth and Soraya. I named them after my parents because I wanted them to remember where they came from. Frank felt tears forming in his eyes. He did not try to stop them. And this, Myra gestured to the elderly male, is my husband, Torvik. He has heard your story many times. He wanted to meet the human who saved his family. Torvik stepped forward and performed a deep bow. My wife speaks of you often, he said. She says you taught her that food is love made visible. She has taught our children the same. Frank laughed through his tears. Did she ever learn to make bread properly? Myra grinned. Eventually, though it took many years and many burnt loaves. The restaurant had gone quiet. Everyone was watching the reunion, witnessing this moment of connection across decades and species. Lucy stepped forward carefully. Would you like a table? She asked Myra. I can clear the best one for you. Myra shook her head. If it's acceptable, I would like to cook tonight. Beside Frank, like I did when I was a child. Frank looked at her, then at the kitchen, then back at her. A smile broke across his scarred face like sunrise after a storm. I would like that very much. They cooked together that night. Frank and Myra side by side, preparing meals for the endless stream of customers. She had learned well over the years, and she moved through the kitchen with skill and confidence. But every now and then, she would pause and ask him a question, just like she had done 40 years ago. Why do you add that spice? Why stir it that way? Why does this dish need more time? And Frank would answer, patiently and thoroughly, because teaching had always brought him joy. The night grew late. The crowd finally began to thin. Customers paid their bills and left with full stomachs and stories to tell. By midnight, only a few people remained. Frank and Myra sat together at a small table near the window, looking out at the stars. Her family had gone back to their ship to rest, but she had wanted to stay, to have a few more minutes with the man who had given her everything. I never thanked you properly, she said. When I was a child, I didn't understand what you had done. I just knew you were hurt and that the bad people were gone. It wasn't until I grew older that I truly realized the price you paid. Frank shook his head. There's no need for thanks. Seeing you here, alive and happy, with children of your own. That's all the thanks I ever needed. Myra reached into her bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. She placed it on the table in front of him. I made this for you. It's bread, following your grandmother's recipe. She smiled shyly. I think I finally got it right. Frank opened the package carefully. Inside was a perfect loaf of flatbread, golden brown and fragrant. He broke off a piece and tasted it, his eyes closed in pure satisfaction. Perfect, he said. Absolutely perfect. Myra laughed, the sound bright and joyful. It only took me 40 years. They sat together in comfortable silence, two old friends separated by species and time, but connected by something deeper. Outside, the stars turned slowly, and the station hummed with quiet life. Finally, Myra stood to leave. She hugged Frank tightly, holding on for a long moment. Thank you, she whispered. For everything? Frank hugged her back. This child he had protected, this woman who had carried his legacy forward. Thank you, he replied, for giving me a reason to keep cooking. She left, and Frank was alone in his restaurant. He looked around at the empty tables, the clean counters, the pictures of Earth on the walls. Everything was exactly as it had always been, But something had changed. For 40 years, he had carried his story in silence. The weight of it had bent his shoulders and filled his eyes with old sorrow. But tonight, that weight had lifted. The story had been told. The truth had been shared. And he was finally free. Lucy found him there an hour later, still sitting at the window. She sat down across from him without speaking. "Are you okay?" she asked. Finally, Frank smiled. It was a real smile, free of shadows. "I'm better than okay," he said. "I'm at peace." He stood up slowly and walked back to his kitchen. There were dishes to clean, surfaces to prepare, ingredients to organize for tomorrow. The work of a chef was never done, but Frank Morrison did not mind. Every meal he made was a quiet promise. A promise that the fighting had meant something, that the scars were worth bearing, and that as long as he could still feed people, he would keep choosing to give rather than take. Outside, the station continued its endless orbit through the stars. And inside a small restaurant called Earth's Hearth, an old human chef hummed softly as he prepared for another day. His story had been told, but his work was far from over.